Hey there, everyone. Today I want to look at Paul Virilio's 1980 work, The Aesthetics of Disappearance. This is an interesting work for sure. Not really sure if it's even worth the read. This is very much an extension of his Speed in Politics from 1977. He's focused on the philosophy of speed, dromology, and this time he introduces a new neologism, picnolepsy, which is described on the back cover as the epileptic state of consciousness produced by speed, or rather the consciousness invented by the subject through its very absence. And it's an interesting work for sure in terms of understanding kind of what it feels like to be in this postmodern condition, so to speak. One of the things that makes me hesitant regarding this work is the fact that Paul Virilio is not a particularly precise writer. He has this stair-step method that Shannon Bell talks about in Fast Feminism and kind of helps explicate what it means. He basically just develops an idea enough where you can get an inkling of an idea, and then he purposely abandons it and just goes to a new paragraph. And it's not very structured in terms of the argument kind of weirdly has like the thesis towards the end of the text, but also just kind of, it's not in any one point. That's the problem. In fact, really the thesis in terms of kind of grounding this whole work, because it just feels like you're in a state of vertigo through the whole text, but not in like a revolutionary, cool, like chic kind of way. It's just like not very well written. But the summary that best articulates this text is actually a quote by Heinrich Heine from the very end of the text in the notes section. And Heine writes, "Through the railroads, space has been abolished, and the only thing left for us is time." And this is one of the points that Virilio emphasizes in Speed and Politics, is that for Virilio, what it means to be is to be in a state of habitable circulation. Just like, for example, a cell must keep itself up by regulating the flows that come in and out of it, the flows of nutrients, the flows of things that threaten its existence. In the same way, as the cell is in this kind of state of habitable circulation, a state of homeostasis, for example, so too is the human, or really any subject of any kind, engaged in this process of habitable circulation. And one of the problems that Virilio mentions is we're kind of increasingly accelerating the tempo at which life occurs. In Speed and Politics, he links this specifically with the military apparatus to show how throughout history, the military apparatus thrives by crafting bodies in a way that makes them not only susceptible to conflict, but more and more engaged in a constant state of circulation, which is to say conflict, that further accelerates the system itself. And in the Aesthetics of Disappearance, this leads to some conclusions where Virilio in Speed and Politics talks about the way the subject starts to disappear at these extreme levels. For example, he talks about the Olympic medalist, and as time goes on and on and on, the time record that it takes, for example, in some kind of swimming event, it gets bested by a shorter and shorter margin. And he says, now we need like technology in order to measure the fine-tuned changes in, for example, what it means to be a gold medalist, such that the idea of the winner, of the gold medalist as such, starts to disappear to the point where we are forced to be aided by technology. And this forces the speed of human society itself to become reduced to, or maybe just shifted to, the speed of our technologies. And this brings us to the idea of picnolepsy. And, lepsy meaning seizure, and then pyknos, is Greek meaning frequent. So this is like a frequent state of seizure. And these states of seizure can be thought of as like, think of like a traumatic event that causes you to change somehow. And, these are going to happen all the time when you're a kid, as your subjectivity is constantly being changed. But then the idea is, as you get older, you get more concrete in your being. You start to establish a steady tempo that you can keep up with. But Virilio, throughout all of his work, really, is just like, it's getting harder and harder to keep up. And sometimes Virilio strikes me as just complaining too much. He's very good at explaining how these shifts in speed happen, but his responses to that, of course, because Virilio is kind of one of these classic early accelerationists, his responses are a little bit problematic, especially because a lot of these accelerationists kind of retain a lot of conservative aspects of where it sounds like they're saying something revolutionary, but actually they're just cloaking complacency in some radical theory language. But he writes here on page 32, the picnoleptic onset would be something that could make us think of human liberty, in the sense that it would be a latitude given to each man to invent his own relations to time, and therefore a kind of will and power for minds, none of which, mysteriously, can think of himself as being any lower than anyone else. So there's a sort of equanimity that happens in the picnoleptic state, where people are being assailed by all these new conditions. They're trying to get some sort of grounding to their being, a sort of existential weight to themselves that keeps them tied down to some sort of stability. And in this moment, Virilio says we're basically all equal under the law. And that, of course, has some Christian connotations because Virilio is Catholic, and that's going to figure through this text to varying degrees. There's a lot of problematic stuff he has to say about women, about abortion in this text as well, which I think is just undergirded by Virilio just going on these weird Bible tangents about how some such and such resembles the fall or something, or is the next step of the fall, or the ironic reversal of the fall, whatever. But he says, with the irregularity of the epileptic space, defined by surprise and an unpredictable variation of frequencies, it's no longer a matter of tension or attention, but of suspension pure and simple by acceleration, disappearance and effective reappearance of the real, departure from duration. So in this kind of epileptic state of things are getting faster and faster, there's this sort of unpredictability that filters into our lives, where the kind of fundamental tension of the subject that might be experienced in Marx's work, for example, when he talks about the worker being alienated from his products because the capitalist is the one that reaps the product and profit of the worker's labor. There's that sort of tension that goes away when these speeds reach such a point where acceleration causes consciousness itself to be in a state of suspension, a sort of state of shock and awe. And this is one of the defining characteristics for Virilio of the postmodern human, is being in this state of disappearance, which this is true and not true. It has connotations of like, oh, the old way of life is disappearing, and as such, we need to try to latch onto it. But luckily, Virilio doesn't really do that. He just kind of laments it with these conservative undertones. He writes, the paradoxical state of waking would finally make them both agree it's our duration that thinks. The first product of consciousness would be its own speed in its distance of time. Speed would be the causal idea, the idea before the idea. And he's doing this in response to Descartes, who says the mind is a thing that thinks. And Bergson kind of responds that the mind is a thing that lasts. So we're not so much, for Virilio, defined by the corporeality of the cogito, of a thing which thinks, as if that thing means something means something about the substance of that thing. Instead, what defines, ontology in general for Virilio is not corporeality, but the temporality of speed and duration. So taking place in time is what defines us ontologically. It's what gives us our grounding, is our feeling of having a tempo that we can keep up with, so to speak. And this leads Virilio to the point here on page 39 where he says, "But if you admit that each one's time has been more or less patched together, and that rapid waking is as paradoxical as the dream, the reality of the passing world could in no sense seem common, and pure reason would be only one of the numerous subterfuges of the picnoleptic scheme and of its savoir-faire, one of the sophistications that worried Bachelard." And then he quotes Bachelard. "Applied rationalism, which is only a philosophy at work, which wants to expand haste of systematic thought, authoritarian propensity that no one questions." And then he continues on his own. "Oppressive work, accompanied from childhood on with heavy punishments, for no one is supposed to ignore reason, as none is excused from knowing the law. The juvenile consciousness, always time's orphan, reason supplies the illusory recommencement of its foreign tale, as operational language. It's the pitiful 'I knew' of the child who has recited his lesson well and so escaped punishment." And, there's a lot going on here with Virilio. He loves to use very flowery language in a way where it doesn't give a lot of context. And he really never gives you a very detailed explanation of the rapid waking that is as paradoxical as the dream. This is a reference to the fact that when one is in REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, the eyes are, of course, moving rapidly, and this is where one dreams. And paradoxically, dreams happen not when one is in the deepest moments of sleep in terms of their brain waves. Dreams actually happen in a way where the brain acts as if it were awake. When you look at the brain waves, it is the highest state of sleep just before one would wake up. So the brain waves of the sleeping person are almost identical to the waking person. So this is kind of Virilio tying these two, like Descartes was worried about the what if I'm dreaming right now? That was his big thing, the dream analogy that helped him ground his ontology in the thinking thing, in the fact that he couldn't doubt that he was thinking, even if he could doubt everything else. Virilio kind of brings these together and he says, well, this state of waking and sleeping in terms of brain waves, they're just paradoxically similar, such that reality kind of passes by in these epileptic states, in the sense of you're just constantly being assailed by new information, by new states. And all of this comes together in a way where we're supposed to use reason to rationally separate the dream from reality. But Virilio's point is that with things like media, reality and, fantasy, which is to say, quote unquote, non-reality, non-being, meld together. And, one is supposed to be like the child who says, "I knew," when he got his lesson right. You're supposed to just know what the real world is, so to speak. But Virilio is saying that it's harder and harder to think about the real world when we're pushed into faster and faster tempos, where the difference between reality and a simulated reality becomes harder and harder to tell apart. I think of, for example, a celebrity, where it used to be that one could be a celebrity and, give off this air of, oh, here's my personality when I'm giving some sort of political speech, and then here I am where you can come interview me and just chat and be normal. And it's not that that difference has gone away, so much that the lines between them have been blurred, such that there is no work life and home life dramatic difference, especially when we think of celebrities, where, for example, an Instagram model his or her very life is to be an image, to be a simulacrum, to be a copy without an original. It's, your copied Instagram persona, but the real persona is the same as the copy. So you've created this copy in the form of the model, in the form of the celebrity, but there is no real which lies behind that, so to speak, which is, acting as a buttress. So Virilio's point here is just that this I knew, this innocent, I can return to reality, is problematic, especially as we go faster and faster. He says on page 61, the acceleration of bodies, the fugacity of movement, as perceived by the vulgar eye, demand a guidance of vision disengaged from mnemonic traces. The whiteness of birds or that of horses, the brilliant strips pasted on the clothes of experimental subjects, make the body disappear in favor of an instantaneous blend of givens under the indirect light of motors and other propagators of the real. The heterogeneous succeeds the homogeneous. The aesthetics of the search supplants the search for an aesthetics. The aesthetics of disappearance renews the enterprise of appearance. So, building on the themes that we've talked about before, with the disappearance of the real subject as we become immersed in appearances, online appearances, public opinion appearances in polls, it becomes more important to think about the aesthetics of the disappearing subject as equally as it is to look at the aesthetics of the appearing subject who appears just rather blankly. Because with this acceleration of just thinking about information or intelligence, as it's called in the military, in the intelligence industry, which Virilio has a lot to say about the fact that intelligence has become an industry, this sort of demands a disengaged, sort of desubjectified view of reality in which we give up the distinction between the real and the copy, kind of similar to Baudrillard, and instead there's just a bunch of instantaneous givens to us. And because we're forced to tarry with this world, to constantly try to establish some sensibility, some stability, we are assailed by a picnoleptic state, which is to say a frequent state of seizure, of being seized by new givens that we have to try to ground ourselves in. But as soon as that happens, those givens become obsolete. And in a similar vein to talking about, for example, this superfluity of celebrity, Virilio says on page 74, minimum transit space, maximum of armchair on the smallest possible surface. The era of the great monuments of the spectacle seems to be over. The new opera is the Boeing 747. A projection room where they tried to compensate for the monotony of the trip by the attraction of the image. Festival of aerial crossings, transitory disurbanization where nomadic micropoles replace the sedentary metropoles. So these sedentary metropoles, this would be the comfortability of the city that adapts slowly, that resists change from immigrants coming in and out, whatnot. And by the way, I'm not being anti-immigration right now. I'm just saying that there's this traditional notion of the city which is cosmopolitan, but nevertheless sedentary. It has some sort of deep culture that can resist being coded, can resist being commercialized. But more and more, cities become defined by everly, microscopic, nomadic micropoles. And, Deleuze and Guattari have some good things to say about the nomad here. Virilio takes at least a more neutral perspective, not so optimistic as Deleuze and Guattari, maybe a little bit even pessimistic or nihilistic here, where he says that, we're basically chopped up into an ever smaller subjectivity, and we are shot at faster and faster speeds, our bodies themselves being turned into vehicles. idea of a vehicle is a very prominent theme in Virilio's philosophy, of a vehicle being one of habitable circulation, of a nomadic micropole, where, the reality of your trip is, just like in the Boeing 747, you're just sitting down doing nothing, even though you're actually shooting through the sky at hundreds of miles an hour. So he says that they have to try to make up for this with all sorts of, plays of images. He writes, "The space-time of vectors, the aesthetic of construction, is dissimulated in the special effects of the communication machines, engines of transfer and transmission. The arts continue to disappear in the intense illumination of projection and diffusion." And this is kind of the point where this text is sort of interfacing with media studies. In the introduction, the introducer kind of states that maybe we shouldn't just assume this is just about media studies, because it's really not. Baudrillard is more kind of in the media studies realm. Even though Virilio loves talking about cinema, ultimately Virilio is more at home in like military kind of stuff. So nearing the end of the work, here on page 114, he speaks of somehow the vision of light moving on a screen would have replaced all personal movement. And this is a very extreme image that Virilio is drawing here, but it's true in a sense in which, one increasingly just sits down in front of a screen and lets things on the screen do the movement for them. Even now we have like robots who will deliver packages, will deliver all sorts of things for people, such that personal movement becomes less and less there as one's selfhood disappears, as their speed disappears, even though speed writ large becomes more and more ubiquitous and acceleration accelerates even more. And he writes, "The development of high technical speeds would thus result in the disappearance of consciousness as the direct perception of phenomena that inform us of our own existence." And that is picnolepsy right there. Because as it says on the back cover of this book, Speed and Politics defined the society of speed. So Speed and Politics focused on, okay, what is the relationship between the speed at which society develops and proliferates and the military technologies that aid that acceleration? And then in the Aesthetics of Disappearance, it defines what it feels like to live in a dromological society, in the society of speed. And it is defined for Virilio by picnolepsy, the fact that speeds are developed with the aid of various technologies, such that there is a disappearance of the individuality of consciousness and the directness of consciousness experiencing a one-to-one correlation with its experiences, precisely because it can experience things like TV, or it can experience polls, it can experience information in a way that, you're obviously experiencing something very different. He talks about at one point there was a TV station that during Christmas time, instead of playing like normal programs on the TV, instead decided to put on there a fake furnace with like fire burning on it, so that it's like your TV turns into a furnace. And for Virilio, that's really indicative of the relationship between technology and this sort of dissolution of individuality. He continues on, "Technology introduces a phenomenon without precedent in the mediation of time. For if we've affirmed that time is only one reality, that of the instant, we might also say, with Guion, as the motor is being invented, the idea of time can be reduced to a point of view. Duration is made of transitory instants, just as a straight line is made of points without depth." And, both of those images of transitory instants and the line made of points without depth is important for understanding Virilio's conception of speed and subjectivity. Because as time sort of stretches out, as we turn into vehicles, Virilio constantly talks about the proliferation of the automobile and how this turns our very body into a mobile vehicle that is linked with consumerism, because people buy cars. They buy their own means to accelerate faster and faster and in a more and more stylish manner, for Virilio to hide the fact that their travel has less and less to do with their body and just becomes like a fact of their existence of, you just travel at 70 miles per hour every day with the chance risk of just dying in a car wreck, which is something terrifying to think about, but is quite in line with Virilio's way of thinking. With time being stretched out in such a manner, with our notion of what time means stretching out to the point where we operate on a technological time, on a global time scale that's, far more mobile, far more acceleratory. Because of this, our consciousness gets defined by time reduced to the duration of transitory instants. These are those givens that Virilio was talking about, just getting assailed with information after information, and it's just constant points that you're trying to latch onto, and you can't. But then the other idea, the straight line of the points without depth, that kind of epitomizes the visual imagery of what it's like to go at like supersonic speed, for example, of what an object looks like as it accelerates more, is that it starts to stretch out more and more, to the point where, for Virilio, this is going to kind of conclude with a point of no depth. And psychologically speaking, of course, that means personalities without depth. So really, for Virilio, time loses its meaning through the relativization of the speeding vehicle. And he continues, by introducing the subject into the hierarchy of speeds, lower or higher, by destabilizing the instant, a contingent phenomenon, the standards are abrogated. The diversifying of speed also abrogates the sensation of general duration, of continuous movement. And once again, this is picnolepsy. The sensation of being in a state of movement with inertia gets kind of messed with a little bit because you're constantly accelerating. So you're never able to establish a sense of inertia, a sense of, okay, I'm kind of at home where I am. I feel like I can get my feet under me because, for example, you've got things like, inflation or wars happening more and more in higher casualty marks. I think of the war in Gaza right now, which is just, it's not even a war, of course. It's a genocide and occupation. But, 30,000 civilians dying in just a very comparatively short amount of time. So for Virilio, this is the kind of thing that points to subjectivity being linked to the destabilization of the instant, where duration becomes a rather arbitrary mark, and there's a sort of extreme mobility which creates the inertia of the moment, instantaneity, which would create the instant. Those are Virilio's words. So I hope that this helps explain a little about kind of what Virilio is trying to do in this work. It's an interesting work. You can read it if you want to. You shouldn't feel hard-pressed to read it. I feel like you could get most of the ideas, at least the important ones, from this text. And, I've had the pleasure to kind of sift through this text and just find all the stuff that's actually important to his thesis, because there's so much just totally irrelevant stuff going on here. So you probably got enough of what you need to get here in order to understand kind of how does Virilio take his analyses in speed and politics and speak of kind of the postmodern condition as such, using those themes of dromology, for example. So I hope this has been helpful. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on various postmodernists, German idealists, gender theorists, and other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom that I do once a month, which you can tailor to your needs. Maybe you need help reading some difficult postmodern stuff. Maybe you need to talk about some philosophical problem. Maybe you just, whatever you want to do. It's yours. So that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.